This mysterious photo from 1901 holds a secret that experts have tried to understand for decades. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 20 years restoring old photographs, but she had never come across anything like this before. It was a humid August morning in 2024, and she sat in her studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts, studying a photograph delivered by the Boston Historical Society. The image, dated 1901, showed the wealthy Thornton family of Beacon Hill standing proudly in their grand garden. The photograph was a fine example of early 20th century portrait work. The Thornton family was carefully arranged on their well-kept lawn. Richard Thornton, the family patriarch, stood at the center, with his wife Catherine beside him. Their 3 daughters wore white lace dresses, and a young boy about 5 years old stood between the couple. Behind them rose their impressive brownstone home, while neatly trimmed hedges framed the scene. Elena had been hired to digitally restore the photograph, which had suffered water damage and fading over time. She scanned it at extremely high resolution and began the slow, careful work of removing stains, correcting contrast, and sharpening details blurred by age. It was while adjusting the background that she noticed something strange. In the deep shadows beneath a large oak tree at the edge of the frame, there appeared to be a figure, someone the original viewers would likely have ignored or mistaken for a shadow or garden decoration. Elena increased the magnification and used advanced digital tools, gently brightening the dark area while preserving detail. Her breath stopped when the figure became clear. It was a woman, a black woman, dressed in simple servant clothing. She stood partly hidden behind the tree, but her position looked purposeful, not accidental. Most striking of all, she was holding an infant wrapped in white cloth. Thanks to the digital enhancement, the woman's face was now visible. Her expression was hard to read. There was sadness there, but also something else. Pride, perhaps, or defiance. Elena leaned back from her screen, her thoughts racing. A black domestic worker appearing in the background of a wealthy white family's photo was not unusual for that time. Many families included servants in their portraits, usually placed at the edges to quietly show their status. But this felt different. The woman seemed deliberately included, yet hidden, and the way she held the baby suggested this was not just a household servant being recorded. Elena zoomed in on the infant. The baby's features were faint, but the child appeared quite light-skinned. She then studied the young boy standing with the Thornton family. He looked about 5 years old, with light brown hair and facial features similar to Richard Thornton. A theory began forming in Elena's mind, and her heart began to pound. She pulled up the original paperwork from the Historical Society. The photo had been donated by Thornton family descendants as part of a larger collection documenting important Boston families. The notes identified the people in the main group: Richard Thornton, his wife Catherine, their daughters Margaret, Elizabeth, and Anne, and their nephew James. According to the records, James's parents had died in a cholera outbreak, leaving him an orphan. There was no mention of the woman in the shadows. No mention of the infant. Elena spent the rest of the day researching the Thornton family. Richard Thornton had been a successful textile merchant, one of the richest men in Boston at the turn of the century. His family moved in elite circles, attended respected churches, hosted large gatherings, and served on charity boards. Catherine came from old Boston wealth, her family history tracing back to colonial times. Like many families of their class, they employed several domestic servants. Elena found census records listing multiple black servants working in the Thornton household in both 1900 and 1910. But identifying the woman in the photograph would take deeper digging. As evening came, Elena printed a high-resolution copy of the restored image and pinned it to her wall. She could not stop looking at the woman in the shadows, the baby in her arms, and the expression on her face. To Elena, it looked like someone trying to claim something that had been taken from her, if only through a photograph. Something important had happened in that family, something carefully hidden in plain sight for more than 100 years. Elena was determined to uncover the truth. The next morning, Elena contacted the Boston Historical Society and spoke with the curator who had sent her the photo. Dr. Patricia Chen listened closely as Elena explained her findings. "I've studied hundreds of photographs from this era," Elena said. The placement of this woman feels deliberate. She isn't randomly in the background. She was positioned so she could be seen, but easily ignored, especially in lower quality prints. Patricia was intrigued. The Thornton family had donated the collection only 6 months earlier. The descendants said they were clearing out an old estate and thought the society might want the materials. They showed no special interest in the contents. "Do you think there's a real story here?" Patricia asked. "I'm sure of it," Elena replied, "but I'll need access to more records, employment papers, birth certificates, anything that might identify the woman and the child." Patricia agreed to help. Together they began reviewing the Thornton family papers donated with the photographs. There were business ledgers, social letters, property documents, and household account books covering the years from 1890 to 1920. In a household account book from 1901, they found regular payments to domestic staff. One entry stood out: Clara Washington, cook and housemaid, $8 per month plus room. The payments began in 1899 and continued until 1902, when they abruptly ended with a single word written in the margin: dismissed. Elena felt a jolt of recognition. Clara Washington. She photographed the page, carefully noting the dates. If Clara had been dismissed in 1902 and was the woman in the 1901 photograph, then something serious must have occurred in that home. As they continued searching, they uncovered something even more telling in a bundle of personal letters. One letter from Catherine Thornton to her sister in Philadelphia, dated March 1901, made Elena's hands shake as she read it. Catherine wrote that they had taken in Richard's nephew James after the tragic death of his parents. She mentioned that the boy was adjusting well, though his arrival had been surrounded by unfortunate rumors, which she insisted were completely false. She strongly stated that James was a blood relative and that they had made certain household changes to maintain proper appearances. The letter was carefully written, but the meaning beneath the words was clear. This family was dealing with a scandal. Patricia later found another key piece of evidence at Boston City Hall. There was a birth record for James Thornton, born in February 1896, listed as the son of Richard Thornton's brother. But when Patricia requested the death records for James's parents, something did not add up. They had died in 1898, not 1896. That meant James would have been 2 years old when they died, not a newborn orphan as the family claimed. "This doesn't make sense," Patricia said, spreading the papers out. "The dates don't match. And look here. James's birth certificate lists Boston as his birthplace, but his parents were living in New York at the time. Why would the mother come to Boston to give birth?" Elena examined the certificate closely. Something about it felt wrong. The handwriting looked slightly different from other records from that year, and there was a note in the margin that had been partly erased. "Amended record," Elena said softly. "This certificate was changed. Someone altered it." They sat quietly as the meaning sank in. A child born in 1896, raised as a nephew, a modified birth certificate, a servant dismissed without explanation, and a photograph showing a black woman holding a baby in the shadows of a wealthy family's garden. The pieces were coming together, though the full picture was not yet clear. Elena knew she had to learn more about Clara Washington. She needed to find out what happened to James Thornton after 1901 and understand why the family went to such lengths to hide the truth. Over the next week, Elena searched every record she could find related to Clara Washington. It was not easy. Washington was a common surname, and Clara had left very few official traces. Still, Elena persisted. Slowly, a story began to form. Clara Washington had been born in Virginia in 1875, the daughter of formerly enslaved parents who moved north after the Civil War. She arrived in Boston in 1897, looking for work as a domestic servant. By 1899, she was employed by the Thornton family, working as both cook and housemaid in their Beacon Hill home. Elena found her listed in the 1900 census, living at the Thornton address. She was recorded as single, black, age 25, occupation domestic servant. But there was a handwritten note in the margin of the census form that Elena almost missed: infant daughter not enumerated. This note was unusual and suggested that the census worker had not known how to properly record a child living in the household. The real breakthrough came when Elena found birth records from Boston lying in hospital, a place that had provided maternity care to both rich and poor women in the early 1900s. In the records from February 1896, there was an entry for Clara Washington, listed as Negro, age 21, who had given birth to a male infant. The father's name was recorded as unknown, but there was more. Attached to the hospital file was a handwritten note from the attending doctor. It stated that the patient was employed by the R. Thornton family, that the infant was to remain with the mother and the Thornton household as part of a family arrangement, and that the hospital fee had been paid by R. Thornton. Elena's theory was becoming clear. Clara had given birth to a son in February 1896 while working for the Thornton family. Richard Thornton had paid the medical costs, and over time this child had been turned into James Thornton, the so-called orphaned nephew. Now Elena needed to learn what had happened to Clara after she was dismissed in 1902. Using city directories and church listings, she traced Clara's life after leaving the Thornton home. She found Clara living in a boarding house in Boston's South End in 1903, working as a laundress. After that year, the trail vanished. There were no census records, no job listings, no death certificate. Then Patricia uncovered a discovery that changed everything. In the archives of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Boston, she found a baptism record from 1896 for James Washington, son of Clara Washington. The baptism had taken place only weeks after the hospital birth, and the child's last name was clearly written as Washington, not Thornton. The church files held something else as well, a letter written by Clara to the church pastor, dated 1902. Patricia photographed it and sent it to Elena right away. Elena read Clara's words slowly, her emotions rising with every line. Clara wrote to Reverend Williams in desperation, saying she did not know where else to turn. She reminded him that he had baptized her son James 6 years earlier, and that she had raised him with love, despite the hard circumstances of his birth. She explained that the child's father was a man of high social standing, whom she would not name, and that he had supported them only on the condition of total secrecy. Clara wrote that the man's wife had decided Clara could no longer remain in their household. She had been dismissed, and worse, she had been told that James would stay with the family and be raised as their own relative. The wife claimed Clara was unfit to raise him and that the boy deserved more than life with a colored laundress. Clara explained that she had been offered money to leave quietly, to never speak of James's true parentage, and to never try to see him again. She wrote that James was her son, that she carried him, gave birth to him, nursed him, and raised him for 6 years, yet she had no legal rights. She described herself as a Negro woman with no family, no money, and no power, while the Thorntons had wealth, us, and lawyers. If she fought them, she feared they would destroy her and possibly harm James. If she accepted their terms, she would lose her child, but perhaps give him a future she could never offer. She ended the letter by asking for guidance, strength, and a way to do right by her son, even as her heart broke. Elena wiped tears from her face. The letter was dated October 1902. Around the same time, Clara was dismissed from the Thornton household. Clara had been forced into an impossible choice. She could fight for her son and almost certainly lose, damaging his chances in life, or she could walk away and let him grow up in comfort and privilege, never knowing his real mother. The photograph from 1901 now carried a new meaning. It had been taken just a year before Clara was pushed out. It showed Clara standing in the shadows holding an infant. But which infant was it? Could there have been another child, or was the photo dated incorrectly? Elena knew she had to examine the image again with fresh eyes, and she also needed to learn what became of James Thornton as he grew older. Had he ever learned the truth? Had he ever questioned where he came from? And had Clara ever tried to see her son again? Or had she vanished from his life forever? Elena returned to her studio and opened the enhanced photograph on her computer. She realized she had focused so much on identifying the woman in the shadows that she had not carefully studied every detail of the image. Now she looked closely at the infant in Clara's arms. Using the highest level of magnification, Elena examined the baby's face and the white christening gown. Then she compared this child to the boy standing with the Thornton family, identified as 5-year-old James. Her breath stopped. The baby in Clara's arms could not be 5 years old. The infant looked only a few months old at most, if James had been born. In 1896, he would indeed be 5 in 1901, matching the boy standing with the family. A cold shiver ran through Elena. There were two children in the photograph. James, the 5-year-old boy presented as the Thornton nephew, and a much younger baby held by Clara. Elena immediately called Patricia. She told her there was another child. Clara was holding an infant who could not be James. She said they needed to find birth records from 1900 or 1901 connected to the Thornton household. Patricia understood at once. They met again at the Historical Society and began a careful search through birth records from 1900 and 1901. This time they knew exactly what to look for. Any birth linked to the Thornton family, any mention of domestic servants, and any records that had been changed or marked as unusual. After 2 days of searching, they found it. In March 1901, just months before the photograph was taken, Boston lying in hospital recorded the birth of a female infant to Clara Washington, described as a Negro domestic servant. Once again, Richard Thornton had paid the hospital fees. The father was listed as unknown, and the doctor's note matched the one from James's birth 5 years earlier. Clara had given birth to a second child in 1901, another child fathered by Richard Thornton. The infant in the photograph was Clara's daughter. Where was this child now? Elena wondered aloud. What had become of her? Patricia began searching adoption files, death records, and any documents that might reveal the child's fate. The search was difficult. Adoption records from that time were often sealed or poorly kept, and many children born to unmarried mothers simply vanished from official history. Then Patricia found an entry in the records of the Boston Home for Colored Children, an orphanage operating in the early 1900s. In their intake records from September 1901, there was a listing for a female infant, about 6 months old, surrendered by her mother Clara Washington. The child was noted as being in good health, with adoption pending. The dates fit perfectly. The photograph had been taken in the summer of 1901, showing Clara holding her baby daughter. By September, only months later, Clara had been forced to give the child to an orphanage. But there was more. Attached to the intake record was another note. It stated that the adoption was finalized in October 1901, that the child was placed with a family in New York, and that the records were sealed at the family's request. It also mentioned a large donation from an anonymous benefactor to support the orphanage. Elena understood immediately. The Thorntons had arranged for Clara's daughter to be adopted away. They had paid to speed up the process and to seal the records. They had taken the second child from Clara, just as they had taken James. But they had allowed her one thing, that photograph. They had allowed her to stand quietly in the shadows of their garden, holding her infant daughter one final time, creating a lasting record of her motherhood, even as they were preparing to take that child away from her. The photograph was not simply a family portrait, Elena said softly. It was Clara's last chance to be seen as a mother, even if only at the edges of the image, even if only hidden in the shadows. Someone in that family, perhaps Richard himself, or perhaps even Catherine, understood that Clara deserved at least that small mercy. Patricia nodded slowly. But why keep the photograph? Why not destroy it if it held proof of their secrets? Because someone wanted the truth to survive, Elena replied. Even if it stayed hidden, even if it took more than 100 years to be uncovered, someone wanted Clara's motherhood recorded. Elena then turned her focus to James Thornton, the son Clara had lost. He was 6 years old. What kind of life had he lived? Had he grown up believing he was Richard Thornton's nephew, never knowing that his real mother had been dismissed from the household during his childhood? She began with census records, following James across the decades. In 1910, at age 14, he appeared in the Thornton household, listed as a nephew and attending a preparatory school. By 1920, at age 24, he had graduated from Harvard Law School and was working at a Boston law firm. The 1930 census showed James Thornton, age 34, married to a woman named Elizabeth, living in Boston's Back Bay with 2 young children. His occupation was listed as attorney. He had clearly achieved success and respect, but something else in the 1930 census caught Elena's eye. Under race, James was listed as white, but there was a small note in the margin, barely visible, that read mulatto, amended. Someone had first recorded James as mixed race and then changed it to white. Elena's heart began to race. Had there been doubts about James's racial identity? Had people noticed that he did not appear fully white, or had rumors about his true parentage followed him into adulthood? She searched newspaper, archives, looking for any mention of James Thornton, and what she found surprised her deeply. In 1935, James made headlines for taking on a controversial case defending a black family who had been forcibly removed from their home in a white Boston neighborhood. The case drew major attention because James, a white attorney from a powerful Boston family, worked without pay to defend the black family against wealthy white property owners. He won the case, setting a legal precedent that weakened discriminatory housing practices. As Elena continued her research, she learned that James Thornton went on to become one of Boston's leading civil rights attorneys. He defended countless black clients, fought segregation in schools and public spaces, and played a key role in several landmark cases that advanced racial justice in Massachusetts. In 1954, the same year as the Brown v. Board of Education decision, James gave a speech at the NAACP's Boston chapter that was covered by local newspapers. Elena found the full text in the archives. He spoke about benefiting from privilege his entire life, from education, social standing, and being treated with respect simply because of his skin color. He also spoke about justice delayed being justice denied, and that separate was inherently unequal. What struck Elena most was a short passage near the end of the speech. James spoke about people in our lives who love us, who sacrifice for us, and whose contributions are never recognized. He said we owe them a debt that can never truly be repaid, and that the least we can do is fight for a world where such sacrifices are no longer required, where love and family are not limited by artificial boundaries of race. Elena wondered if James had known. Had he somehow learned about Clara? Had he devoted his life to civil rights because deep down he understood that his own existence was shaped by racial injustice? She knew she needed more answers. She needed to find James's descendants, if any were still alive, and see if they had preserved letters, papers, or memories that might reveal what James truly knew about his origins. Elena located James Thornton's grandson through public records. Michael Thornton, age 68, was a retired professor of African American history living in Cambridge, just a few miles from Elena's studio. When she called and explained her research, there was a long silence on the line. "I think you should come to my house," Michael finally said. "There are things I need to show you." 2 days later, Elena sat in Michael's living room, surrounded by boxes filled with documents and old photographs passed down from his grandfather. Michael was a tall man with dark eyes and skin that could be seen as either white or light-skinned black, depending on who was looking. "My grandfather died in 1975, Michael began. "He left me a sealed letter with instructions not to open it until after my father passed away. My father died 5 years ago, and I finally opened it. What I read changed everything I thought I knew about my family." He handed Elena a yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter written in James Thornton's handwriting, dated 1974, when he was 78 years old. James wrote that by the time Michael read the letter, both he and Michael's father would be gone, and that Michael's father had never known the full truth of their family's origins. He explained that he was writing because Michael was a historian, someone committed to uncovering difficult truths, and because he believed Michael would understand why the secret had been kept for so long. James confessed that he was not the orphaned nephew of Richard and Catherine Thornton. He was the son of Richard Thornton and a black woman named Clara Washington who worked in their household. Clara was his mother, though he had been raised to call her by her first name and treat her as a servant until she was dismissed when he was 6 years old. James explained that he did not learn the truth until he was 30. In 1932, an elderly, frail woman approached him outside his law office. She told him her name was Clara Washington and that she was his mother. She showed him documents, his original baptism record, a letter she had written to her pastor, and a photograph of herself holding him as an infant in the Thornton garden. At first, James did not believe her. The claim seemed impossible. But Clara knew intimate details of his childhood. The names of his favorite toys, a song she used to sing to him, a birthmark on his shoulder that no one else would know. James spent weeks verifying her story, checking records and speaking to former servants from the Thornton household. Everything Clara told him was true. James wrote that his first reaction was anger toward Richard Thornton, toward Catherine, and toward everyone involved in the deception. But Clara asked him not to be angry. She told him she had made peace with what happened, that she had watched from a distance as he grew up, went to university and became a lawyer. She told him she was proud of him and had never regretted giving birth to him or loving him during the 6 years they had together. She also told him about his sister, a daughter born 5 years after him, also fathered by Richard Thornton. That child had been taken from her and adopted away. Clara had searched for her for years but never succeeded. She showed James the same photograph he kept in his desk, the one showing her holding an infant in the Thornton garden. That baby, she said, was his sister. James wrote that he spent the final years of Clara's life visiting her, learning about her experiences and the impossible choices she had faced. She died in 1935, and he was with her at the end, holding her hand and calling her mother for the first time since he was 6 years old. After her death, he dedicated his life to fighting the injustices she had endured, becoming a civil rights attorney because he understood how racial lines destroyed families and denied basic human dignity. James told Michael that he was part African-American history, that Clara Washington was his great-grandmother, and that he carried her strength and resilience. He asked Michael to honor her memory and to try to find his lost sister, if any trace of her still existed. When Elena finished reading, she sat in silence. Tears streamed down Michael's face. He told her he had been searching for his great-aunt for 5 years, chasing sealed adoption records and lost files from the Boston home for colored children, reaching dead ends again and again. Elena thought of the photograph of Clara standing in the shadows holding her baby daughter. "That photograph is the key," she said. "It is the only visual proof that your great-aunt ever existed. If it is properly shared, if historians and genealogists see it, someone may recognize a family story or have records that connect." Michael nodded slowly. He spoke about how his grandfather had spent 40 years fighting for civil rights without ever publicly revealing his own connection to the black community. He had lived with the secret, honoring Clara in private while presenting as white in public. Now the photograph proved everything James had written. There was something else, Elena said gently. James's legacy, his legal victories, his impact on Boston, all of it came from Clara, from understanding what she suffered, from knowing that his own life was shaped by exploitation and injustice that he spent his life fighting. Clara's legacy, Michael said quietly, not the Thornton name. Everything James achieved came from her strength, her sacrifice, her love. Elena and Michael spent the next 3 months preparing to reveal the truth behind the 1901 photograph. They gathered every piece of evidence: birth records, hospital notes, Clara's letters, James's confession, and the photograph itself, carefully verifying each detail. Michael contacted relatives, some shocked by the truth, others admitting they had always sensed something hidden in the family story. In November 2024, the Boston Historical Society held a press conference to announce the discovery. Elena presented the photograph, now fully restored and carefully enhanced, showing Clara Washington standing in the shadows, holding her infant daughter, while the Thornton family posed in the foreground with her son James. The story quickly became national news. Major newspapers published long features about the image and the secret it had hidden for 123 years. Television news programs interviewed both Elena and Michael. The photograph spread rapidly on social media, sparking deep conversations about hidden history, racial injustice, and the complicated truth behind many American families. But the most important response came from an unexpected place. 3 days after the press conference, Michael received an email from a woman named Diane Roberts who lived in Harlem, New York. She was 79 years old, and she believed she might be descended from Clara Washington's daughter. Michael called her right away, and what Diane told him made his hands tremble. Her grandmother, who had died in 1980, had been adopted as an infant from a Boston orphanage in 1901. The family had been told only that the baby's mother was a domestic servant who could not keep her child. No other details were ever shared. Diane's grandmother grew up in New York, married, had children, and spent her life wondering where she came from. "But there's something else," Diane said. "My grandmother kept a small photograph that was given to her adoptive family. It shows a black woman standing in a garden. My grandmother always believed it might be her birth mother, though she could never prove it." Michael asked Diane to send the photograph. When it arrived 2 days later, his heart nearly stopped. It was another print of the same 1901 photograph Elena had restored, but this version had been cropped to show only Clara and the infant. The Thornton family had been removed from the frame. Someone, perhaps Richard Thornton or someone else in the household, had made sure Clara's daughter received an image of her mother holding her. It was an act of quiet mercy, a way to ensure that even though the child would be raised by strangers, she would still have a connection to the woman who gave birth to her. Elena arranged for Diane to travel to Boston. When Diane arrived, Michael met her at the airport. They looked at each other with awe and emotion. They shared a great-great-grandmother. They were family, separated for more than a century by adoption, racism, and deliberate secrecy, yet family all the same. At the Historical Society, Elena showed Diane the full photograph and pointed out Clara standing in the shadows. Diane cried as she looked at her great-great-grandmother's face for the first time with certainty. She was beautiful, Diane whispered. She was proud. Look at how she's holding that baby, holding me. She loved me, even knowing she would have to give me up, she loved me. Michael then showed Diane the letter written by his grandfather James. The letter revealed that James and Diane's grandmother had been siblings, both children of Clara Washington and Richard Thornton, separated and raised in completely different worlds. Diane spoke softly about her grandmother's life. She lived her entire life as a black woman, married a black man, raised black children, and lived through segregation and the civil rights movement. She never knew she had a brother who was passing as white and fighting for civil rights from the other side of the color line. They were both Clara's children, Michael said quietly. Both carried her legacy. Both were shaped by the injustice that tore them away from her. James fought in the courts, Michael said. Diane smiled through her tears. Her grandmother had been a teacher in Harlem for 40 years. She taught hundreds of black children, told them they were smart and capable, and prepared them for a world that often tried to tell them otherwise. She did, for other people's children, what Clara had not been allowed to do for her. She nurtured them, believed in them, and fought for them. As Elena listened, she understood something deeply powerful. Clara Washington had lost both her children to a system designed to break black families and erase black motherhood. Yet both children, raised in different worlds, had spent their lives pushing back against that injustice. James through the legal system, and Diane's grandmother through education. Both had carried Clara's strength and love into work that changed lives. The discovery of the photograph's secret sparked a wider discussion about hidden black ancestry in white American families and the countless black mothers separated from their children throughout history. Historians began re-examining old family photographs, searching for black domestic workers standing at the edges, wondering how many other Claras had been hidden in plain sight. Michael and Diane worked together to honor Clara's memory. They created the Clara Washington Foundation, dedicated to researching forced family separations during the Jim Crow era and supporting genealogical research for African Americans seeking relatives lost to adoption, migration, or racial violence. They also partnered with the Boston Historical Society to create a permanent exhibit about Clara James and the photograph. The exhibit featured the restored image, Clara's letters, James's confession, and modern reflections on how racism shaped American families. Elena contributed by creating a series of detailed enhancements of the photograph. See close-ups of Clara's face, the infant in her arms, and James standing with the Thornton family. Each image included historical context about domestic servitude, anti-miscegenation laws, and legal systems that allowed men like Richard Thornton to exploit black women without consequence. The exhibit also faced a hard question. How should Richard Thornton be remembered? He had fathered 2 children with Clara, a woman who worked for him and had little power to refuse his demands. Was the relationship truly consensual, or was Clara exploited by a man who held complete social and economic control? Clara's own words offered insight. In one letter, she wrote that she could not say she had been forced, but she could not say she was free to refuse either. What freedom did a servant have when her employer demanded her presence? What choice existed when refusal could mean hunger or homelessness? She admitted she cared for him, but care formed under such unequal power could not truly be called love. The exhibit presented Richard Thornton not as a simple villain, nor as a hero, but as a man who took part in a system of racial and economic exploitation, even while showing moments of limited mercy. He paid hospital bills, allowed Clara to keep James for 6 years, and may have arranged for the photograph that preserved her motherhood. The photograph itself became iconic. It appeared in textbooks and classrooms, teaching students about hidden histories and the complexity of race in America. Museums across the country requested copies. Artists created works inspired by Clara's image, honoring her dignity and mourning the children taken from her. Yet the most meaningful legacy came from the family itself. Michael and Diane, brought together by the discovery, became close friends. They introduced their children and grandchildren, rebuilding family ties that had been broken for more than a century. Michael's children and grandchildren, who had grown up identifying as white, now faced the reality of their black ancestry. Some embraced it, feeling it explained something they had always sensed. Others struggled, unsure how to reconcile their lived experience with this new truth. Diane's family, who had always identified as black, welcomed the white relatives they never knew existed, though there was pain too. Pain in knowing that some of Clara's descendants had benefited from whiteness while others endured its denial. These conversations were difficult, but Michael and Diane believed they were necessary. Clara's legacy, Michael said at a family gathering, was not just the photograph. It lived in all of them, in facing the truth, understanding how racism shaped their family, and choosing to move forward together. The publicity led to one last unexpected discovery. A genealogist in Connecticut named Thomas contacted Michael after seeing the story. While researching his wife's family tree, he discovered that her grandmother, adopted from the Boston Home for Colored Children in 1901, might also be connected to Clara's case. The records showed the adoption happened at the exact time Clara's daughter had been placed. Michael met Thomas and his wife Linda and showed them the photograph of Clara holding the infant. Linda broke down in tears. Her grandmother had died when Linda was young, but her mother had said the woman always felt something was missing. Though loved by her adoptive family, she often wondered about her birth mother. She kept the small photograph on her dresser her entire life, looking at it and saying, "She loved me. I can see it in her eyes. She didn't want to give me away." DNA testing confirmed the truth. Linda was also Clara Washington's great-great-granddaughter. Linda, Diane, and Michael were all descendants of Clara. 3 branches of a family tree, deliberately cut apart, had found each other again. Together, they traveled to Boston to visit Clara's grave. She was buried in a cemetery in Roxbury, in a section for black Boston residents. Her headstone was simple, listing only her name and dates. Clara Washington, 1875 to 1935. Standing at her grave, Michael, Diane, and Linda held hands. They told Clara that her family had found one another, that her children and grandchildren were reunited, and that her story would be remembered. Michael spoke softly, saying she had been hidden in the shadows of the photograph, but she refused to be erased. She insisted on being seen as a mother, even at the edges. Because of that photograph, because of her courage, they had found each other. They had found her. They later commissioned a new headstone, one that told the truth. Clara Washington, 1875 to 1935, beloved mother, her strength lives on in her descendants. The dedication ceremony for the new headstone was attended by more than 100 people. There were descendants of Clara, descendants of James, former students of Diane's grandmother, lawyers who had once worked with James Thornton, and historians who had been inspired by the discovery of the photograph. Elena spoke during the ceremony, explaining how she had first noticed Clara hidden in the shadows of the family photograph and how digital restoration had revealed what had been concealed for 123 years. Clara Washington had been made invisible by a society that denied black women their full humanity and denied black mothers the right to their own children, Elena said. But Clara found a way to be seen. She stood in that garden holding her baby and chose to be photographed. That quiet act of resistance, that refusal to disappear completely, is what allowed her story to survive. Clara may have known she would never be able to speak her truth openly, but she made sure there would be proof. She made sure that one day someone might look closely enough to notice her. After the ceremony, Linda approached Elena with tears running down her face. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for looking closely. Thank you for seeing my great-grandmother. Thank you for not letting her stay hidden." Elena hugged her, deeply moved by what this discovery had meant for Clara's descendants. A photograph she had been hired to restore had uncovered an entire hidden history, reunited a family separated for more than a century, and restored dignity to a woman whose motherhood had been denied and erased. 6 months after the dedication of Clara's headstone, Elena's work on the photograph was featured in a major museum exhibition titled Hidden Histories: Black Women in the Shadows of American Photography. The exhibition included the Thornton family photograph alongside many other images where black women appeared at the edges of the frame, partially hidden, pushed into the background. The central idea of the exhibition was clear. These women had been intentionally made invisible by families and photographers who wanted to present an image of white respectability. Yet their presence in the photographs, even at the margins, served as proof of their labor, their relationships, and the hidden family ties that many white families tried to deny. Elena's restoration of the Clara Washington photograph became the heart of the exhibition. Visitors could view the original faded image, where Clara was barely visible in the shadows, next to the restored version where her face and the baby in her arms were clear. The contrast showed just how much had been hidden and how modern technology could help uncover buried truths. As the exhibition traveled to museums across the country, people came forward with their own stories. Families spoke of long-suspected secrets, whispered memories of black ancestors who had been erased, and old photographs showing unnamed figures standing at the edges of family portraits. Michael, Diane, and Linda took part in panel discussions at several exhibition stops, speaking about what it meant to uncover Clara's story and how it changed their understanding of their families and themselves. Michael talked about the weight and privilege of passing, and about his grandfather James choosing to live as white while still fighting for black civil rights. Diane spoke about her grandmother's life as a black woman who never knew she had a brother passing as white, working toward the same goals from a different place in society. Linda shared the pain of adoption and separation, and the deep relief of finally knowing the truth about her great-grandmother's love. The exhibition also drew criticism. Some people argued that focusing on images of black domestic workers in white households risked repeating stories of black subservience and white dominance. Others questioned whether it was right to display photographs of women like Clara, who may never have agreed to have their suffering shown publicly. Elena addressed these concerns seriously. In the exhibition catalogue, she wrote that care must be taken not to repeat the erasure and exploitation being examined. Clara Washington deserved to be remembered not only as someone who was wronged, but as a full human being, a woman who loved deeply, made painful choices, showed great strength, and found a way to record her motherhood even when it was denied. The photograph was proof of injustice, but it was also proof of Clara's agency, her resistance, and her refusal to disappear. The exhibition ended with a section on modern consequences showing how forced family separation, denial of black motherhood, and hidden black ancestry continue to shape American families today. It included stories from adoption, foster care, and child welfare systems that still separate black children from their families at higher rates. It connected Clara's experience in 1901 to ongoing patterns of systemic racism. For Elena, the project had grown far beyond restoring a photograph. It became a mission to honor Clara and the many women like her whose stories had been buried, whose motherhood had been denied, and whose presence had been erased from family histories. She reflected on this in the final chapter of a book she wrote about the discovery. "When I first noticed that shadow in the garden," she wrote, "I didn't know I was looking at Clara Washington. I didn't know I was about to uncover a story of love and loss, power and resistance, separation and reunion. I only knew something felt hidden. That is the work of historians. We look at what others overlook. We question what has been accepted. We bring light into the shadows." Clara Washington lived much of her life in the shadows of the Thornton family's world, but she made sure she stood in that photograph. She made sure that even if she was pushed to the margins, she was still there, and 123 years later, she was finally seen. The book became required reading in many American history courses. The photograph appeared in textbooks. Clara's story entered the historical record, no longer hidden and no longer denied. Michael, Diane, and Linda continued their work through the Clara Washington Foundation, helping other families uncover hidden histories and reconnect with relatives lost to adoption, migration, or deliberate erasure. They funded DNA testing, supported genealogical research, and pushed for the opening of sealed adoption records. On the 125th anniversary of the photograph in 2026, Clara Washington's descendants gathered at the site of the former Thornton Mansion in Boston. The building had become a community center, and the garden where the photograph was taken was now a public park. More than 50 people attended, descendants of both James and Sarah, reunited as one family. They planted a tree in Clara's honor, placed a plaque telling her story, and shared memories of how her legacy had shaped their lives. Elena was there and felt deeply moved as she watched Clara's family, once divided by race and secrecy, standing together where Clara had once stood holding her baby and insisting on being seen. Clara Washington's story is not only about the past, Elena told the group. It is about how we choose to remember, how we honor those whose voices were silenced, whose presence was denied, and whose love was hidden. By bringing Clara out of the shadows, by telling her truth, we are not just correcting history, we are saying that every mother matters, that every person deserves to be seen, and that justice can still arrive, even 123 years later. As the sun set over the garden, Elena looked once more at the photograph that had begun everything. Clara Washington stood in the shadows holding her infant daughter, her face now clear to the world. She was no longer hidden, she was no longer erased. She was finally, fully, undeniably seen, and her legacy lived on through her descendants, the foundation bearing her name, and the countless people inspired by her story, ensuring she would never be forgotten.